Now, I don't know if you're as much of a baseball fan as I am, but if you are, you may remember the event that's photographed on the screen here. This is a game between the Red Sox and the Yankees, two teams that have one of the fiercest rivalries not only in baseball, but in all of professional sports. And you can see that these two players took that rivalry to heart, and eventually it led to a conflict between the two of them. Well, this conflict, this rivalry, is something that we can think of as being a really strong analogy to what was happening in Europe leading into World War I. So we'll keep this in mind as we explore this question. Why did tensions increase in Europe before World War I? Let's begin. Let's start with a look at our lesson goals. First, we'll describe the effects of rising nationalism and ethnic conflict in Eastern Europe. Then, we'll explain political and economic conflicts among imperial powers. Then, we'll analyze the effects of growing militarism in Europe. All of these goals will help us to learn about the growing tensions that led to conflict in Europe. Now let's take a look at our key vocabulary words. These words to know will come up throughout the lesson. It's a good idea to take notes on them as you see them come up, and also to become familiar with them now. They are undermine, conscription, ethnic group, militarism, and nationalism. Now, you might already be familiar with what's happening in Europe leading up to World War I, but we'll review that to get kind of an idea of what it is that's leading to this conflict. Now, it's going to be the countries in Europe facing these kind of increasing tensions in the early 1900s as a result of competition and internal conflicts. Now, we can see the map here showing us that in the 1900s, the leading powers of Europe included Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, these countries are competing with each other for influence and prestige, economic superiority, colonial territories, and military might. And all of these kind of competitive conflicts are going to eventually lead to a war that includes all of these countries and some others. Now, it is indeed going to be rising tensions in Europe that lead into World War I, and some of the issues that cause those rising tensions included nationalism, imperialism, and militarism. Now, we're going to talk about each of these in turn, and by the end of the lesson, we should be able to answer this question. Why did tensions increase in Europe before World War I? Let's begin by talking about nationalism. First, let's define nationalism. Nationalism is defined as loyalty and devotion to one's nation. And you can see a painting here that's depicting Danish soldiers returning from war and coming home to a pretty large parade. You can see people are really excited. Someone is giving a kiss to one of the soldiers on the cheek. You can see a lot of people are holding their hats in reverie up in the air. And then you can see all of the flags that are being held up high. People are really excited and they're really passionate. And this passion for their country is translated into nationalism. But nationalism can cause tensions. We can see these tensions in a couple of different ways. One, in tension between countries, so one country against another. And we can also see nationalism cause tensions within countries. So if there's a certain ethnic or religious group that wants independence, it might push for that independence through nationalism, so you can see that's within a country. So when we kind of think about how these tensions are rising in Europe leading up to World War I, we can say that it is indeed growing nationalism that's leading to troubles between nations. This nationalism it stems from everything from economic rivalries to territorial conflicts to diplomatic disagreements. And in the political cartoon that we're looking at here, we can see that each country is kind of symbolized through some sort of activity, and we'll talk about three of them in particular. So what I just circled is Prussia, or Germany, and you can see it's depicted as a very large man that's kind of trying to impose itself onto the other countries surrounding him. Then we can see France depicted as a man with a beard pushing back against Germany. And then finally, let's take a look at Great Britain. Great Britain is depicted as a man who's kind of looking on in disgust, but has his back turned to the rest of Europe. Let's ask ourselves, what is the symbolism behind these depictions? What does it mean with regard to how these tensions are rising in Europe? So let's keep this political cartoon in mind because we'll try to unpack some of the ideas that come from it in this lesson. But let's take a look at a specific example of how nationalism is leading to the growing tensions that begin World War I. Now, we're talking about a region called the Alsace-Lorraine, which you can see depicted here as being kind of right in the middle between France and Germany. Now, France and Germany are fighting over control of this region because it has iron and coal deposits that are really important to industrialization, which was hot at this time, right? We're right on the heels of the Industrial Revolution, and so countries are trying to industrialize quickly. Now, a conflict that was fought between France and Germany called the Franco-Prussian War was ultimately responsible for France losing the Alsace-Lorraine region, and France hoped to regain it, and so the tension between France and Germany was really palpable going into World War I. These countries did not like each other. And what complicated the issue even further is the fact that this region included people of both French ancestry and people of German ancestry. And so this is a conflict that's not only going to be complicated, but it's going to lead to tensions between these two countries and tension within the region that kind of straddles both places. We know that nationalism can cause tensions between nations, but let's take a look now at how they can cause tensions within nations. Now, the first thing we need to think about is why might a group of people want to have their own country or be independent? And a lot of that has to do with sharing an ethnicity. So what we're going to find is that all over Central and Eastern Europe in the early 1900s, there's a lot of ethnic tension starting to develop. And ethnic groups are groups of people that share common ancestry or language or culture. And many of these different ethnic groups wanted their own nation states, or they wanted an independent country of their own. And you can see this map of Central and Eastern Europe by 1914 is showing us many different ethnic groups, and a lot of them are kind of struggling with this desire to become independent and becoming kind of more nationalistic as a result. So we're going to take a look at a couple of maps and look more closely at how this is developing. But first, let's take a look at an important social studies strategy, analyzing maps. Now, when you analyze a map, you want to first look at the title. From there, you want to understand the location that you're looking at. So it's really going to kind of give you that context. It's going to drive you in. And then if there's a key, you want to make sure to read that so that you know exactly not only what the location is, but how the boundaries are drawn, and or what information you're getting from that map. And then once you know exactly what you're looking at, where it is, what information is being provided to you, this is when you need to start drawing conclusions by looking for patterns and trends. So if you want to kind of walk through this process with me, we'll take a look at a map that's showing us ethnic groups in the southern Balkans in the 1900s. Now, we're talking about a region called the Balkans, which was home to a wide population of people, a variety of different ethnic groups, and some of those groups had successfully declared independence, Serbia and Greece particularly. And this is going to inspire some of the other ethnic groups to perhaps seek their own independence as well. And on top of this, we're starting to see the decline of the Ottoman Empire for a couple different reasons, but partly due to the nationalism of a lot of these different ethnic groups that are seeking their independence at the time. Now, Another region where we're seeing some similar developments is Austria-Hungary, which is also ethnically diverse. And by the late 1800s, a lot of these ethnic groups had begun demanding independence as well. And you can see this map here showing us the different ethnic groups in Austria-Hungary, and we're looking at several different ethnic groups, and you can imagine that as they're all starting to develop these nationalistic movements, this is going to lead to some trouble for the Austro-Hungarian Empire because independence for all of these different groups would eventually cause this empire to collapse. One of my favorite things about studying history is looking at political cartoons, because political cartoons are written or drawn rather as current events, and they really give us insight as to how people are perceiving events as they happen. Now, this cartoon that we're looking at was published in 1912, 2 years before World War I began. And what you're looking at are men that are meant to represent major European powers. And the pot that they're sitting on, and you can see that they're all kind of balanced very precariously. It's very kind of uneasy, the balance that they have on this pot. And the pot is called Balkan Troubles. So essentially what this is showing us is that these leaders, these countries, these powerful countries in Europe are trying their best to keep the lid on these troubles in the Balkans, but they're not having a lot of luck. Those troubles are just growing and growing and growing. And particularly, we want to point out the gentleman that's right in the middle with the pointed hat on. That's the Kaiser of Germany. And we want to keep this hat in mind because we're going to see another, we're going to get another look at it later on in the lesson. Now that we have a better understanding of how nationalism leads to rising tensions in Europe, let's take a look at how imperialism is going to increase those tensions as well. And remember, we're looking at this question: why did tensions increase in Europe before World War I? Tensions are rising in Europe going into World War I partially because of imperialism. And we can see this map showing us how imperialism is affecting the world by 1914. And we can see many different countries are engaged in this activity, this growth of their empire or their nation. But no country is engaged in more imperialism at this time than the United Kingdom. And the UK is this very small country right in the middle of our map. But as you can see, according to the key, the UK has grown or imperialized all over the world. And so part of this growth, and by the way, it should be mentioned that the United Kingdom is going to hold by this time 1/5 or 20% of the world's geographic boundaries. Now, this imperialism is going to cause a lot of conflict all over the world because as these European countries started to grow in the early 1800s, they find themselves in direct competition with one another. The world is only so big. So, once you take a certain space, that means it's that much less space for another country to take. And so as a result, nations are taking steps to undermine or kind of secretly hurt each other overseas. And sometimes countries are even going so far as to take over each other's colonies, which is creating a lot of resentment and bitterness. So one place that this is happening really kind of directly leading into World War I is in Africa. Now, this is an issue that's going to date back to the early 1800s, this period in which European countries are competing for African colonies. And a couple of things are happening that are leading to this growing resentment and tension. So again, we're looking at a map of what's happening in 1914, this time what's happening in Africa in 1914, and you can see that a lot of different European countries have gotten involved in colonizing Africa. And particularly we're seeing this action of undermining happening as France and Russia are beginning to supply weapons to Ethiopians who were rebelling against attempted control by Italy. And so Ethiopia, we see here, is trying to fight off the Italian imperialism, and France and Russia is undermining undermining Italy by supplying weapons to those nationalist Ethiopians. As well, we're seeing Germany becoming very resentful towards France and Great Britain because you can see that Britain and France, based on the color coding, they have a great deal of territory in Africa, and Germany wants a piece of that. So Germany, you can see, doesn't have as much and is becoming, so Germany's just got kind of smaller regions, and as a result, is becoming very resentful towards these other countries. Now that we know a little more about how nationalism and imperialism are both leading to rising tensions in Europe going into World War I, let's stop and take a look at how militarism is also leading to these rising tensions. Because remember, we're trying to answer this question. Why did tensions increase in Europe before World War I? Finally, militarism is leading to increasing tensions in Europe going into World War I. And militarism we can define as aggressive government support or pursuit of military power. Now, you can see a photograph here of soldiers, and you can see kind of that line of soldiers seems to go on forever, well beyond the borders of the picture. And that really kind of shows what militarism is. It's growing your army and your navy, because the hope is it's going to make war easier to pursue. And as a country that is pursuing militarism, your hope is that other countries, particularly the countries you see as threats or enemies, are going to be less likely to want to fight you, but if they do want to fight you, you are going to be less likely to use diplomacy to solve conflicts. So diplomacy is the idea of kind of mediating something through dialogue or conversation or finding some sort of peaceful agreement. And with growing militarism all over Europe, countries that have a conflict are less likely to use diplomacy if they have these strong militaries. And so this militarism is going to directly lead to something we call an arms race. And why is that happening? Well, we know that European nations want these powerful militaries in order to protect their interests. But what that's going to do is it's going to have a domino effect, and it's going to create the other countries, again, particularly those that are in conflict or are threats to in conflict with or threats to one another, to want to do the same thing. So you're going to see one country start to militarize very rapidly after another, and this is going to lead to what we call an arms race. Again, as one country increases its armies, others are going to increase theirs as well. So what's going to happen in Europe, particularly in the early 1900s going into this conflict, is first Great Britain and Germany are going to start to grow their navies. Now, at first, we're going to see Britain with the world's largest and most powerful navy, but Germany is going to try to compete with that. And so Germany is going to start to increase its navy in order to compete, and then Britain, as a response, remember that arms race, it's just one after another, Britain's going to increase its production following its seeing a threat of Germany doing the same thing. Now, what we're looking at here is one of these armored naval ships that England created called a dreadnought. And by 1906, we're seeing these dreadnoughts kind of all over British seas, and Germany is going to start to try to create the same type of ship. So this type of ship kind of becomes universally known as a dreadnought. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about other ways that militaries grow, but let's take a moment to check in first. So militarism can be seen in the form of the arms race that we saw in the naval competition between Great Britain and Germany. But we can also see militarism through the increasing number of soldiers on the ground. Now, nations, as a result of growing militarism and the arms race that's happening leading up to World War I, are creating what we call conscription programs. You might also know this as a draft, basically forcing all men of a certain age to enlist in the army. And the reason they're doing this is to increase the size of their armies, which includes both a standing army and sometimes reserves. And we'll talk about kind of the difference between the two. But first, let's point something out, because you might remember the political cartoon where we pointed out that the German Kaiser was depicted wearing the pointy helmet. Well, you can see in this photograph here of German soldiers that they are indeed wearing these pointy helmets, and that kind of becomes a way to symbolize the German army going forward. So just a way to kind of connect the dots there. Now, through mobilization, countries are able to call up troops and move them quickly. So remember, we talked about a standing army versus reservists. Well, some countries will say, well, look, you don't have to be part of the standing army. You don't have to go to work in the armed forces every day, but you do have to be ready to mobilize at a moment's notice, and that means you're a reservist. So through this advanced mobilization plan, countries are able to sustain kind of a large reserve army in addition to their standing army. And you can see in this chart here showing us some of the European armed forces by 1914, and we can see that both those standing armies and the reserve forces were quite large going into World War I. France and Germany had standing armies in the millions, and Germany had reservists nearing 10 million people. And you can also see kind of the number of warships that each country had developed by this time. Now, when you look at a chart like this, you want to ask yourself questions like, why does Germany have so many people in its standing and reserve armies? Well, remember, Germany is kind of sandwiched in between two countries that it does not trust at all, France and Russia. So it wants to keep a really large army so that it could be prepared to mobilize against either of those two countries, or perhaps both at the same time if it needs to. As well, we might want to ask, why does Great Britain have such a large navy? Why so many warships? Well, remember, Britain controls 1/5 or 20% of the world's landmass going into World War I. So it wants to be able to not only control but protect all of its colonies at a moment's notice. As we try to understand why tensions increased in Europe before World War I, let's take a look at this timeline, which will hopefully help us visualize some of those major events. Now, we're looking at a timeline that's showing us the events leading up to World War I, which occurs between 1914 and 1918. Beginning in 1821, Greece is going to gain its independence, and that's going to lead to a lot of other nationalism within Europe, eventually leading to Serbia winning independence in 1862. And then the imperialism of the time is going to lead to Germany annexing Alsace-Lorraine in 1871. Now finally, militarism is going to kind of lead us into conflict when the naval arms race began between Britain and Germany around 1900. Now let's return to our lesson question and begin to wrap up the lesson.